Hi everyone, this is Josiah Sinanen, the host of the Anticulture podcast, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of our show here on YouTube. This week's episode is really exciting for me. I sat down and chatted with Ginella Massa, who is the CBC News host of her show Canada Tonight with Ginella Massa, which I've been a panelist on since January of this year. Ginella is known because in 2015 she was the first national television reporter in Canada to wear a hijab. And many people think she might have been the first in North America to do so. So she is definitely paving a new route for cultural acceptance and multiculturalism in Canada. And it was so great to talk to her about her journey and the challenges she faced, but also talk about more identifiers that are associated with Ginella that aren't talked about as often as what's visible, including her Afro-Latina heritage. So I'm really excited to present our interview to you guys today. And I hope you enjoy the episode. If you want to catch Ginella's show, it is on the CBC News Network every single weekday, and it's called Canada Tonight. And if you enjoyed the podcast, I would highly invite you to subscribe at josiahpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And we have so much more great season coming up for you. And hopefully we have a couple more episodes before the Christmas break here. So I'd really appreciate the support, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Anticulture. I'm your host, Josiah Sinanen, and in today's episode, we'll be diving into cultural identity, Canadian multiculturalism, and Canada's National Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, as we sit down with Canada's first hijab-wearing television reporter, Ginella Massa.
The more exposure that I gained, the further I got in my career. I came to Toronto, which you think would be, it's a more multicultural city, but it also meant a lot more exposure, a lot more international attention. The more of that I got, the more hate I received. So it kind of went hand in hand. And, and sometimes I get asked too, do you like being recognized as the first hijabi journalist, or do you wish that one day you could just be a journalist?
Before we dive into today's show, I wanted to let you know that Anticulture is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network. You can check out this show and more like it at albertapodcastnetwork.com. Today's episode is brought to you by ATB. ATB was built to help Alberta businesses. From CEBA applications to lending information, debt consolidation loans, or deferrals, whatever your business is facing right now, ATB is here to help with expert advice. And with today's economy top of mind in business, stay up to date with The Future of Podcast, hosted by ATB's chief economist, Todd Hirsch. To learn more, visit atb.com. We're also shouting out Park Power, your friendly local utilities provider in Alberta, offering internet, electricity, and natural gas with low rates, awesome service, and profit sharing with local charities. In Alberta, you get to choose where you buy your internet, electricity, and gas from. If you choose Park Power, you are choosing a positive local business. Plus, Park Power shares its profits with local non-for-profits that are working to make a difference for their communities. Shopping local is very important to Park Power's owner, Chris Kozowski, and we love local here at the Alberta Podcast Network, so it's a great fit. Learn more at parkpower.ca. Ginella Massa is a Canadian Screen Award winner who made history in 2015 as Canada's first hijab-wearing television reporter. Known for her hard-hitting journalism and widely credited reporting portfolio in Canada, Ginella hits a unique intersection of cultural identity. Like myself, Ginella has a myriad of identifiers: Afro-Latina, Muslim, Canadian, North America's first hijab-wearing television reporter. But don't box her in just yet. Join us as we talk about the navigation of her identity, her experiences in shattering the glass ceilings around her, and how she became a national host of the CBC News Network with her show, Canada Tonight. Since January of this year, I've been a culture panelist on Ginella's show, and I got to flip the script with her today and get to interview her and put her in the interviewer's seat. So it's an honor and privilege to present this episode of Anticulture. I really hope you enjoyed the episode with Ginella Massa. Hello, Ginella. Thank you so much for being on Anticulture with us today. It's an honor to talk to you. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe introduce yourself to get started, maybe tell us a little bit about Canada Tonight, and let everyone know what you're about.
Yeah, my name's Ginella Massa. I'm the host of Canada Tonight on CBC News Network. It's really surreal, actually, to be a part of a show that has my name attached to it. It's actually Canada Tonight with Ginella Massa, and we're into month 8, no, 10, 11. We started in January. So almost getting up to a year, which feels crazy. But just it was so exciting to be part of a new show that I got to help develop, and really kind of put my take on. I've worked in news for 11, 12 years, almost, and yeah, as both behind the scenes and on air, as a reporter, as a producer, as a writer. So to be kind of on this national stage is really exciting.
Definitely, yeah. And do you feel like this is kind of a culmination of all the work you've done so far, those 11 years of journalism? Was this something you envisioned for yourself?
I mean, a culmination, absolutely. Did I envision it for myself? I think for a long time, I didn't even allow myself to dream that big. I'm recognized as the first hijab wearing television news reporter in Canada. That happened in 2015 when I was hired as a reporter in Kitchener. And for me, that was a big accomplishment. That was a big kind of reaching of a goal. And I remember I talked to people then and they'd say, "Oh, what's next for you?" And I would say, I'm just trying to do this really well. I'm just really excited to be here. And didn't even really think about what more I could do. And so that's why I say it is so surreal to have this position as the host of a national program, to have my name on to see my face on a commercial, because I think for a long time this was a space that I didn't see people like me in. So to even think that I could be in this space and occupy this space in the way that I do now seemed so far-fetched. And so every little milestone that I achieved, I felt really lucky and really grateful. And, then I would achieve a little bit more and I'd be like, oh, okay. So, I feel like I didn't really set out to set bigger goals for myself. I just kind of was going to see where it could take me and how far I could go.
That's amazing. And we're so honored. I'm so happy that I live in Canada and that we have that, title that got bestowed to you as the first hijab wearing television reporter. I think that's amazing. And congratulations for all your success.
Thank you.
I did want to ask a little bit more about that because I think it's obviously an amazing thing to have associated with your career. But I'm also curious if that's something that did that come across right away? Did people kind of recognize like, oh, this is the first time this has happened? And did that initially make you feel kind of strange? Or were you like, this is great, I'm going to run with it. This is going to be kind of the thing that sets me apart?
It's so funny because I feel like for a while it was kind of the elephant in the room that I had to address. As even when I was like applying for on-air jobs, and it was actually something that was it was recommended to me by a former professor who her husband was Jewish and he had worked in TV and he wore a yarmulke, and that was kind of not really common, and had kind of a similar experience a little bit. And she said, you kind of have to be the one to address the elephant in the room. No one wants to say it. No one wants to ask. No one wants to bring it up. They don't want to be accused of discrimination. But the reality is they have questions, they have assumptions. And it may be a reason that they pass you over because they don't know and they're not sure. So they don't want to bring it up, and they may not offer you the job because of their own fears about your limitations. So you have to be the one to kind of bring it up. So I did. And I think that helped a lot, when I was going through job interviews, and I would say, look, I recognize that, this might be a big risk for you. No one's ever hired anyone who looks like me on TV. And, and I'd open the door to a conversation and be able to let them ask me questions and, quell any sort of fears or misconceptions that they might have about whether or not it would limit my work. And the reality was that it didn't. And so I think that opened the door for a lot of people to feel like, okay, I can have a conversation with her about it. She's open to talk about that. And, and the reality is that, I'm able to do my job just as well as anyone else. And so, when I had my first on-air job, it was nerve-wracking that first day going on TV. Obviously, as a young journalist, your first time on TV, You want to make sure you do well. You want to make sure that you impress, that you don't feel like, they regret hiring you. And then on top of that, I had this added layer of like, what's the reaction going to be? Are people going to, come and pick it outside the station and write emails to my boss? And, I didn't know. And so I was pleasantly surprised. This was in Kitchener, Ontario, just outside of Toronto, by the positive reaction, the overwhelmingly positive reaction, and in some ways the lack of reaction. That like no one really blinked. And I'd be out and shooting stories by myself. I was a video journalist, so I was out by myself shooting stories, and people would come to me, "Oh, you're the new girl at CTV. We love watching you. You're doing a great job." And that was so encouraging, to feel like people could look past what I'd chosen to wear and see me as a journalist and recognize me for my work. At the same time, the more exposure that I gained, the further I got in my career. I came to Toronto, which you think would be, it's a more multicultural city, but it also meant a lot more exposure, a lot more international attention. The more of that I got, the more hate I received. So it kind of went hand in hand. And sometimes I get asked too, like, do you like being recognized as the first hijabi journalist, or like, do you wish that one day you could just be a journalist? And yeah, I would love for one day to the conversation be just about my work and how great it is. But right now I feel like I have to have the conversation because I'm one of one. At least on the national scale, there are other hijab wearing reporters locally, that I know of at least two in Canada, that have come after me. And so that's really inspiring, but still, there's still so much there's room for more.
Yeah. And I'm curious, when you started off in your career, especially on television, was that something that you mentioned it during your job interviews and kind of just addressed that elephant in the room. I'm curious if you recognized before you got into this field that might be a limitation for you, just maybe because of how our culture is, or what kind of expectations you had for yourself. And then following that, I guess, what was it that made you choose television specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I did and I didn't think about it. I feel like on the one hand, like I knew it was going to be a first, but on the other hand, I tried to put it out of my mind because I didn't want to put too much pressure on myself. And I did kind of, have in the back of my mind the fear about like, will I be accepted in this industry? Will I be rejected? And it was also interesting because, people asked me, did I face racism or discrimination in the industry? And I would have to say no, because no one ever told me to my face, right, you're not going to get hired because of how you dress.
Right.
But I knew that it was a conversation that was happening behind closed doors. And I knew that, I could guess. And sometimes people don't have to say it, because most of the time, racism and stereotype and prejudice isn't obvious or in your face. It's in, backhanded compliments. It's in ignorant questions. It's in underestimating me. It's in assumptions.
Right.
So I had more of those kinds of interactions that led me to believe that people are kind of, not sure
right,
about whether, I belonged in this space. But that ambiguity is almost what gave me the room to be able to push forward and say, well, maybe I'm just imagining it. Maybe it's in my head, or maybe, later on I did find out that one of my professors had a conversation with one of my classmates. And this was like, 5 years after I graduated, and I was on air. My classmate told me, hey, I've seen you, I've been watching you on TV, so proud of you, so excited for what you've accomplished. I just wanted to tell you something that happened. When we were in school, one of our professors had pulled me aside and had asked, would you talk to Ginella? Do you think that she would ever consider removing her hijab? She's really talented, but I'm afraid she's going to have a hard time in the industry. Yeah. And so she didn't have a conversation with me, probably because she thought she would get in trouble for,
right.
Right. Like, and so she asked my friend to kind of have it casually with me. And my friend was horrified and was like, absolutely not. No, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
And she never told me about it. until
Wow.
much later. And in a way, I'm kind of grateful that I was kind of shielded from that. And I really appreciated knowing though, right? So, and I've had other conversations with producers when I was working, behind the scenes who didn't know that I was wanted to be on air, who'd say things like, oh yeah, they'll never put a woman in hijab on TV. It's just too distracting, and just kind of flippant comment and not recognizing the impact of that. So yeah, I mean, so yes, I mean, I think there were moments too when I was younger where I thought maybe I'll just go into radio. Then it doesn't matter what I look like. If me and you were having this conversation audio only and you hear my name, Ginella Massa, right? You might paint a picture in your head and have no idea what I look like. And I can use, and I did use that to my advantage a lot when I worked as a producer, and I'd be calling up folks to come to the studio, and then they'd show up looking for Ginella Massa. And it'd be me, brown skin, hijab, and they were not expecting that. And so, yeah, so I thought, oh, maybe I'll go into radio and then it doesn't matter what I look like. And it was my mom who said, well, don't change your dreams. Don't change your goals and diminish yourself because you think other people might not want to give you a chance. Like, don't stop yourself before you've even started, right? And so she really encouraged me to like go for it. And, so you have a talent and you deserve uh, to be on TV, like, and
Yeah.
so yeah, so she really encouraged me to kind of go after it. And just because it hadn't been done before didn't mean that I couldn't be the first.
That's amazing. That's so inspiring to hear. And I mean, there's so much talk around that identifier associated with you. And I think it's a positive, and it's also something that I think must be interesting to navigate because, I mean, now you kind of have broken that glass ceiling. You have a national program, but there's so many other things that make up who you are. You're an amazing journalist. You're Afro-Latina, which I think a lot of people didn't
Yeah.
know. Um,
Yeah.
there's so much that makes up who you are beyond hijab wearing reporter in North America.
Yeah.
And
And that's a
I,
part of my identity that often gets ignored,
yeah,
forgotten, erased.
totally. And how much of those other identifiers do you wish were kind of more highlighted? Or are you kind of just like, hey, listen, let's just look at me and treat me like a person and look at my work?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's a huge part of my identity that makes up, who I am. I was born in Panama to Spanish speaking parents. I speak a little bit of Spanish. I mean, maybe that's why I shy away from it, is because then people want to be like, prove it. And then I have to embarrass myself with my broken Spanish. But it is a huge part of who I am, and, my identity and how I see the world is a part of, the food that I eat and the music that I listen to, and my culture and my upbringing. I still have a lot of family in Panama. I do speak a bit of Spanish and I understand. And sometimes that gets forgotten because I think that it's, people want to put me into a little box. And it's much easier to just look at that part of my identity, especially because it's so visible. But it's important, I think, even just as a journalist, because I bring so many different parts of my experience to my journalism, and it informs how I see the world. Not just because I'm, an immigrant, but also, I came with a single mom who, with two kids. She had $100 in her pocket, barely spoke English. And, that shaped me. I grew up with not a lot of money. Me and my sister were the first in our families to go to university. So all of those things impact how I see the world and impact my storytelling and what issues I think are important for us to cover, who we should talk to, how I can relate to my guests that I have on my show. So yeah, sometimes it gets forgotten, but I mean, it does come out in other ways,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense of how I relate to some of the people that I speak with.
Totally. And I think something that I thought was really fun was when you kind of were sharing a bit of your like DNA backstory and
Yeah.
just kind of saying like, hey, I'm actually a black woman as well. And that might not be the first thing that comes to mind when we're talking about Ginella Massa or when we're seeing you on TV. And I just love that
Yeah.
because I think that's the situation for so many Canadians and myself included. There's this ambiguity, there's so many layers to what identity is, but those can come out in different ways as you're talking to people or as you're navigating life or being excited about something. And something that comes to mind actually is when we were doing a panel on Canada Tonight and we were talking about the Britney Spears story. And
Yes.
that was so fun for me because we did a lot of like serious stories, and I think a lot of people were commenting on my ambiguity and not sure what to think about me. And it was kind of my first time being a little bit more public, and to be able to talk about something that's fun like that people might not expect, was exciting for me. And I think there's a joy in bringing out those different parts of one's identity.
Yeah, I mean, I know whenever someone asks me, "What's your background?" and that's such a common question, I'm sure you get
Right.
it
Yeah.
too. When you're kind of racially ambiguous, "What's your background? Where are you from?" And I know every time I answer that question, like I'm in for like a 20-minute conversation
Right.
because there's so many follow-up questions. But you mentioned my ancestry because, you know, from Panama, for so long I actually only identified as like Latina. I'm Hispanic. I'm Spanish speaking, and only later in life really came to understand and accept my Blackness, because it wasn't something that we really grew up talking about. Even though if you look at me and you look at my family, you look at my grandmother, like we're Black. I'm one of the more lighter skinned in my family, but my cousins and my grandmother, she has, that is African type hair, and we're Black. But if you were to ask my grandmother, she would say, no, we're not Black. Um, to her, the idea of someone Black is someone from the Caribbean, someone from Jamaica, who they speak English, right? And we have a lot of that in Panama, people who came to work on the canal. And that was her definition of Black, right? But we have, there's no doubt that African ancestry, just looking at our features, we just don't know what it is. And it's through slavery. So my aunt did this DNA test and the ancestry DNA test. And I can't remember the percentage, but it was the majority. The majority percentage was West African. I believe it was like Nigeria and Ghana, and then like the next one was indigenous, which we knew that we have, like, my great grandmother is indigenous to Panama. There are many tribes in Panama. And then the smallest percentage was like European, Portuguese, and Spain from colonizers.
Wow.
So I'm like, here it is, Grandma. Like, there's no doubt about it. We are Black. Like, there's no shying away from that, and we say it loud and say it proud, right? But even the idea of being Afro-Latina, like that phrase, that word, what didn't come into my vocabulary until I was maybe in university. And I heard someone say that, and I said, "Oh, that's what I am."
Wow.
That's what I am, and relating to that word.
And how does that now that you have this terminology for it, how does that kind of come out in how you express yourself today? Was there something that shifted when you had that name for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just a matter of like claiming that part of my identity proudly and naming it, and that is not something to be ashamed of. I mean, I think that for my grandmother, there's a lot of internalized racism. There's a lot of, back home, you look at people with fair skin and that's what you relate to pretty, right? That's what you relate to beauty. I remember being told, like, I didn't know much about my ancestry, except someone would say, "Oh yes, but your grandfather, he was half French and he had green eyes." And like, why is that the part of my identity that I know about a grandfather that I've never met? Right? Like, that's the part that we would celebrate and talk about and be so proud of. When clearly, as I see when I look at my DNA, that like there's so much of me that has come from Africa, and that's something that I should also celebrate and also claim. So yeah, just being able to kind of unapologetically and proudly take on that part of my identity and not shy away from it.
I love that. And thank you so much for sharing all that detail. Would you be able to share with us kind of what's happening with you next? What's happening on Canada Tonight? Where are you expecting to kind of take the next step of your journey?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking me that same question that I haven't been able to answer for the last 6 years.
You're just on the ride.
I'm just on the ride. I'm on the journey. I'm always trying to do the best that I can where I am, and learn as much as I can in the place that I am, and be open to opportunity and be open to growing. And, for me, I don't like to get complacent. I like to always challenge myself. And, this is a real new challenge, especially taking on a new job during a pandemic. and starting a new show at a new station with a new team, some of whom I've never still met in person a year in. It's been a interesting road. I'm very much looking forward to when we can all be back together in the office because yeah, we've had our work cut out for us trying to build something and build relationships and trust and with people through a little screen. So I'm just trying to do the best I can where I am and see where it takes me.
And do you have a favorite moment in the journey so far that sticks out to you with Canada Tonight?
Oh gosh, this is always such a hard question to answer because people ask me a lot. People ask me this a lot throughout my career. Do you have a favorite story or favorite person that you've interviewed? And the thing is that the moments that have always stuck with me are always the tragic ones, are always the sad moments, and they stay with you. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think that, in news, you cover a lot of doom and gloom. You interact with a lot of people who've experienced trauma and hardship, and we have to really, be conscious of the fact that they're trusting us with their stories. And so they do stay with me. And for me, in the last year, the biggest event that has stayed with me was the London attack. And actually, I wasn't meant to be working that day. Someone had called in sick, and so I came in early to fill in the afternoon before my show. And an hour before the show, we found out that this hit and run that had happened the day before was being classified as a hate crime. The victims were Muslim. And so we, went into breaking news mode, and we were going to do the full hour on this story. And so, I've kind of put my journalism hat on, and I'm in breaking news mode, and we get onto the set, and every guest I had on that hour was Muslim. We had someone from National Council of Canadian Muslims, an imam from the local mosque, a local city councillor who was a Muslim, and there was something really comforting, or I at least felt, here we were talking to these people who had just learned this news half an hour ago, and we're coming on live TV to talk about it, and we're still like digesting and processing it. And I felt really grateful that it was me who was on the other side of that, doing the interview, because they knew that I was somebody who understood what they were feeling in that moment, who could empathize with them and was going through it with them at the same time.
Right.
So even though it was this horrible, tragic thing, I just thought, wow, I feel really blessed that I got to be here for these folks, in a way that maybe another reporter couldn't. And that extended into, our coverage of the vigil. And I made some comments that night as well about, the impact of what had happened and how, I was feeling as a Muslim woman. And I got so many messages that night from people. Thank you so much for, being a voice for us, and this is why, we need to see ourselves on a national stage like this. And that was really heartening. And that will stay with me for a long time.
That's such a powerful moment of history, and I'm so glad that you got to be the one that was covering it, as you said, and show that empathy and voice to the nation. That's really powerful.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ginella, and thank you so much for being an example that there are no limitations on our dreams. And I just really appreciate what you represent for us in Canada and beyond, and appreciate the time to get to chat with you today.
Thanks so much, Josiah.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Anticulture. We have a great season ahead of us still, with a lot more episodes that I'm excited to share with you. Make sure you're subscribed to the show and follow us along on social media at Josiah Podcast. You can also check out our website at josiahpodcast.com. You can watch Ginella Massa every single weeknight on CBC News Network at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific on her show Canada Tonight with Ginella Massa. You can also follow Ginella on Instagram at Ginella Massa TV and on Twitter at Ginella M. Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode, and we'll see you next week for another episode of Anticulture.